The 4 decades of rock on 106.1 Rock Radio. All this week, the 60s. If you can remember it, you probably weren't there. Today, the motors.
We're talking about the 60s. Let's talk about 60s transport and motoring with the author and journalist Alastair Walker. Hi, Alastair.
Hello, Steve.
At the beginning of the 1960s, how are most people getting about the place?
I would say they're either trudging the streets grimly or waiting for a bus. I mean, back then, cars were still almost a middle-class form of transport. You know, the 60s were the decade of mass transport as regards cars. Most people who had a bit of money then would probably buy a scooter or a motorbike, and I think there were about 130,000 scooters a year sold in 59, 1960s. There was a huge boom. But then as soon as the Mini came out in late 59, that was kind of about the same money, about 500 quid, as a top-of-the-range motorbike with a sidecar. So anyone who'd got hitched or hadn't got hitched, not a baby on the way, would get their money down and get a Mini. That's really the start of the 60s car boom.
I think between the wars, the British motorcycle industry had pretty much ruled the world. BSA had a slogan, 1 in 4. 1 in 4 motorcycles sold in the world is a BSA. So how have they let that position slip by the beginning of the 60s? Or has it?
Well, by the start of the 60s, the thing with the 60s is the Japanese hadn't really got going. They'd only started exporting to America by sort of 1960. That was when Kawasaki opened their first office over in LA. But before the Japanese, before Honda and Suzuki came along sort of 63, 64 onwards and absolutely finished the British off, they had it their own way. There was no real competition, and that's why they sold so many bikes. And they sold a hell of a lot of bikes in the States, which really kept Norton, BSA and Triumph going. But all that was kind of demolished. I think the bike that really was the final nail in the coffin was definitely the CB750 at 69 at the end of the decade. Because up until then, there were no real big bikes over 500cc that the Japanese produced.
But we enter the 60s, don't we, Alastair? And the superbike, the ultimate road burner, the bike of choice for the coffee bar cowboys, for the cafe racers, was British, was the Triumph Bonneville, or perhaps another British bike, a BSA Gold Star. Why is it that by the end of this decade, by the end of the 60s, the dominant road bike is a Japanese motorcycle? At the beginning of the decade, the Japanese were nailing rotivator engines to bicycles, weren't they?
It wasn't quite that crude. I mean, Honda started racing in the mid-50s, you know. They were very, very quick to learn. And I suppose in a way they were doing what the Chinese have been doing the last 10, 15 years. They were taking things to bits and figuring out how it worked and making it faster and making it cheaper and making it that bit better. But the first small bikes, the Japanese bikes that came in the 250s, were incredibly fast. Were like 90, 95 miles an hour. And a BSA 250 would struggle to do about 70, and then it would probably blow its valve gear right through the gas tank and into your main internal organs. In a word, they were rubbish, and they were mostly post-war rubbish that had never really been developed all the way through the 50s.
But how will you explain this fanatical devotion by scooter enthusiasts for their gleaming machines? Scooters, hundreds of them, all assembled for an international rally which brought a carnival atmosphere to the Essex seaside town of Southend. Holland, France, Belgium and Italy were among the 15 visiting countries who came with riders and machines dressed in the best of national traditions.
The mods kind of got on board when the main scooter boom in Britain had kind of been and gone. It was a late 50s, early 60s phenomena, and you actually had companies like BSA and Triumph making embarrassing scooters, basically bolting a motorcycle engine over the back wheel and wrapping it round with steel tubes and sticking panels on it and going, there you have it, a scooter. It's a motorcycle in disguise, you fools.
I spoke to the descendants of the founders of the Velocette Motorcycle Company, a very well-respected British bike maker. He said that their attempt at a scooter, I think it was called the Viceroy, God knows why I've retained that piece of information, but it was a particularly dreadful machine, and it was so poor and it cost them so much money to develop it, and they sold so few. He'd actually finished Velocette as a manufacturer, this dreadful scooter. Why were we so bad at it and the Italians so good at it?
I think it's because the Italians started like the Japanese started. I mean, Mitsubishi made scooters in the early 1950s, just like Lambretta and Vespa did.
Vespa, built for comfort, speed and safety. Vespa.
And they all made it for the same reason. They were forbidden by law because they'd lost World War II from making aircraft or anything much to do with aircraft. So when they sat around and looked at the starter motors that had turned over the bomber engines World War II, all these 100cc two-stroke engines, they thought, what are we going to do with these? And the undercarriage from a lot of the bombers is pretty much the front end of a scooter.
Well, look at a Vespa with that monofork, that single-sided fork. That is the undercarriage of an aeroplane, isn't it? That's how an aeroplane undercarriage works.
The Piaggio light bomber of World War II. You know, and the British didn't have that. They didn't start with a clean sheet of paper. They tried to sort of adapt what they had and make it fit the market. But they didn't understand it. The scooter boom of the late 50s and early 60s in Britain was people just trying to get to work and not wait around for buses and trams and whatever. The Italians made them quicker, simpler, cheaper and lighter because they built a production line for the things right from scratch.
All right, smart lot, we've got the hour. What the turnout? Vespa is always worth inspecting. Sleek modern styling, compact power units, quick change, car tape wheels, plus a spare. Vespa's cheap to run, up to 130 miles a gallon, and what a smooth ride. Get your haircut, you horrible little man! 6 different models to choose from. A Vespa is the in thing to be out of. Inspect the Vespa yourself. And go!